Julian Thorne had everything: a billion-dollar empire, a beautiful mistress, and a divorce he thought he had won. But one night, inside New York's most exclusive restaurant, he saw his ex-wife, Elena, radiant, pregnant, and sitting beside Damien Salvatore, the one man powerful enough to destroy him. What Julian thought was victory became the beginning of his downfall. This story reminds us that love, loyalty, and respect are worth more than any empire. If this story moved you, please support the channel with one like and one share. Thanks for watching. Julian Thorne had everything: a billion-dollar empire, a beautiful mistress, and a divorce he thought he had won. But one night, inside New York's most exclusive restaurant, he saw his wife, Elena, radiant, pregnant, and sitting beside Damien Salvatore, the one man powerful enough to destroy him. What Julian thought was victory became the beginning of his downfall. This story reminds us that love, loyalty, and respect are worth more than any empire. If this story moved you, please support the channel with one like and one share. Thanks for watching.
He had everything. Julian Thorne commanded a billion-dollar empire, had a supermodel on his arm, and a messy divorce he'd just won. Tonight, he was at New York's most exclusive restaurant, a place of power and wealth, celebrating total victory. But one glance across the crowded room turned his blood to ice. It was his ex-wife, Santa Elena, woman he had thrown away. And she was very, very pregnant, sitting next to Damien Salvatore, the one man on earth. Julian could not afford to make an enemy. This story isn't about love, it's about a king realizing he lost his heir to the man building a bigger kingdom. Julian Thorne didn't just enter a room, he conquered it. Tonight, the room was Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a phone number. You were either invited or you were a nobody, and Julian was definitely a somebody. The dark wood floors seemed to silence his every step. The watch on his wrist was a quiet signal. $150,000. It said, "I don't need to try." Across from him, Amelia Vance was radiant. She was 24, an eternity younger than his 42, and her beauty was modern and sharp. She was like his high-rise penthouse, all glass, sharp angles, and an amazing view. "To the Odyssey Project," Julian said, raising his glass of Macallan 25. The amber liquid shined, "and to me for getting it." Amelia tilted her head, her platinum blonde hair catching the light. "To us, Julian, you couldn't have handled that gala without me. Senator Walsh absolutely loved me." Julian smirked. She wasn't wrong. Amelia was his best recent acquisition, a social key who charmed politicians. Meanwhile, he was the shark circling in the deep. He'd just finalized the first phase of the Odyssey project that very afternoon. It was a massive, multi-billion-dollar green energy deal that would make his company, Thorne Capital, untouchable. He had to shed his old life to get here, and his old life was Elena. Elena had been comfortable. She had grace, intelligence, and a quiet strength. She was a like vintage watch. But she was also safe. She wanted a family. She wanted him to be present. She wanted him home. She never understood the thrill of the hunt. In the end, her stability felt like an anchor, and he was a man who needed to fly. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. It was clean, brutal, and fast. He gave her the Hamptons house and the settlements large as was an insult, basically saying thank you for your service.
He had Amelia. He had the deal.
He had his freedom.
Did you hear me, darling?
Amelia purred, pulling him from his thoughts. "I'm thinking Gastad for Christmas, or maybe Moustique. We can finally go public, really public." "Whatever you want, sweetheart." The scent of her expensive perfume filling his senses. These were the spoils of war. He signed the check, a number that would make a normal man choke, and stood up. He was the king of this city. He could feel the eyes in the room on him, a mix of jealousy and respect. He turned to leave, his hand on Amelia's lower back, the very picture of power. And that's when he saw her. In the best booth, the one he always requested, tucked away in a private cove of velvet and gold, sat Elena. It wasn't just that he saw her. It was the complete and total shock of the scene. Julian Thorne froze solid. His hand, which had been guiding Amelia, slipped from her silk dress. His breath caught in his throat. It was a physical blow, like a punch to the gut. The background noise of Aurelia, the clinking glasses, the quiet chatter, faded into a dull ringing in his ears. Elena was not the woman he'd left. The woman he'd left was pale and thin, her eyes haunted by the betrayal of their final months together. This Elena was radiant, a simple, elegant emerald green dress that whispered old money and perfect tailoring, not the trendy fashion he now preferred. Her dark hair was pulled back, showing off the perfect lines of her face, but it was her body that locked his gaze. She was pregnant. Not just a little pregnant. She was very pregnant. The curve of her belly was round and obvious under the soft material. A wave of possessive, primal rage washed over Julian. The timeline was tight. 6 months. She looked to be about 7 months along. The math made his head spin. They had been trying for years. It was the great unspoken failure of their marriage. All the sterile appointments, the charts, the cold procedures, and the growing disappointment. It was one of the many cracks he'd used as an excuse to find comfort with Amelia. He had left, and she had gotten pregnant the very next day, but the shock of pregnancy was instantly overshadowed by the man sitting with her. He wasn't just any man. He was Damien Salvatore. If Julian Thorne was new money, a titan who clawed his way to the top, Damien Salvatore was the son. He was old money. Salvatore family owned half of Europe's shipping lines. And lately, Damien had used that fortune to launch Ares Tech, a technology company that was the only real threat to Thorne Capital's plans. Damien was the whisper to Julian's shout. While Julian S.'s face was on Forbes, Damien S. was rarely ever seen. He was private, ruthless, and by all accounts a genius. And he was looking at Elena not like an acquisition, but like she was the only person in the entire world. His hand was resting gently on her back. He laughed, a real, relaxed sound that Julian never heard in business, and Elena laughed right along with him. She laughed. Julian? Julian, what is it? Amelia's voice was a sharp, annoying sound. You look like you've just seen a ghost. I have. Julian managed to choke out, his voice thick. Oh my God, Amelia breathed, following his gaze. Her eyes went wide, and her pretty face twisted into a mask of pure nasty spite. Is that her? And she's, oh, how tacky. To be pregnant so fast, so desperate. Julian wasn't listening. He was watching Damien Salvatore lean in and brush a stray piece of hair from Elena's face. It was a gesture of such casual, deep intimacy that it made Julian's blood boil. This wasn't just an ex-wife moving on. This was a statement. This was a hostile takeover of his past. He watched as Damien signaled for the check, and the restaurant's owner, the famous Jean-Pierre, rushed over personally. He helped a very pregnant Elena stand up, his hand under her elbow. Damien was an imposter in Julian's favorite booth with Julian's wife. And Julian thought with a terrifying coldness that settled deep in his bones with Julian's child. He had to know. He started to move. Julian, no, Amelia hissed, grabbing his arm. Don't. You'll look like a fool. He shook her off. Stay here. He crossed the floor. The tables he passed seemed to feel the change in the air. The room grew colder. He reached the private cove just as Elena and Damien were turning to leave. Elena looked up, and her smile, the one that had been for Damien, disappeared. Her face went pale, then hardened into a mask of cool, polite distance. It was a look he hadn't seen in 10 years. It was the look she gave to strangers. Julian, she said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake, and that, more than anything, made him furious. Elena. His voice was a raw whisper. He couldn't pull his eyes away from her belly. The silence in the sofa was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, vibrating with their entire history. Damien Salvatore, who was just a little taller than Julian, didn't even flinch. He simply shifted his position, placing himself almost invisibly between Julian and Elena. It was a quiet, powerful act of protection. His eyes, a clear, smart gray, were impossible to read. Julian Thorne, Damien said. His voice was smooth with a faint European accent. It was the kind of voice Julian's rough New York background taught him to distrust. Damien Salvatore. I don't think we've been properly introduced, though. I do admire your work on the Odyssey project. It was a perfect opening line. It acknowledged Julian's power, established his own, and subtly reminded Julian they were rivals. Salvatore? Julian nodded stiffly, his eyes still locked on Elena. He forced himself to look at her face. You're well. You look well. I am, Elena said simply. There was no apology in her voice. No need to explain. Amelia, unable to stay away, had crept up behind Julian. Elena, it's been ages. We were just celebrating. Julian landed the entire Odyssey project. Isn't that just wonderful? Elena's eyes flicked over to Amelia. It was a quick glance, but it was crushing. She didn't acknowledge the younger woman's words, just her presence, with a tiny dip of her chin before dismissing her completely. Amelia turned a blotchy, angry shade of red. Julian couldn't hold back anymore. The question was a physical pressure in his chest. You didn't waste any time, Elena. He made a crude, angry gesture toward her stomach. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Damien's hand, which had been on Elena's back, now rested on her arm. Elena met Julian's gaze. Wasting time was what we were doing before, Julian. Remember? Wasting yours hoping you would show up. I just decided to stop. So you run to him? Julian sneered, nodding at the multi-billionaire as if he were just some pool boy. Julian, this is not the place, Elena said, her voice low and firm. This is my place, Julian shot back, his voice rising. A nearby table fell silent. This is my booth, and you're here with him, he spat, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked at them like they were something he owned, happy, healthy, loved. Julian's fists clenched. That's my child. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. The words just hung there in the air, thick and poisonous. Elena closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, the woman who had once loved this man was gone. In her place was a stranger, armored and unbreakable. No, Julian, she said, her voice cutting through the restaurant's quiet. This is my child. You have no claim on anything here. We'll see about that, Julian threatened. I'll call my lawyers. You'll do nothing. Damien cut in and stepping forward until he was right in Julian's face. You will not harass. You will not threaten her. This night is over. You're embarrassing yourself. And hearing that from Damien Salvatore, of all people, was a new kind of humiliation for Julian. He was always the one who dismissed people, not the other way around. Elena, Julian said, trying a new angle, pushing past Damien to talk to her. Elena, look at me. We tried for so long. This is ours. You can't just take that from me. Take it? Her laugh was sharp and bitter. You gave it away, Julian. You gave us away. She glanced over at Amelia. For her, you signed the papers. You gave up your rights to our marriage. You don't get to build your new life and still lay claim to mine. She turned to Damien. Darling, I'm tired. Can we please go home? Home. The word stabbed him like a knife. Damien put a hand on her back. Of course. He walked past Julian without even a second look. He didn't have to. He'd already won. Julian just stood there, frozen, watching them leave. He watched Damien Salvatore guide his very pregnant ex-wife out of the restaurant, his hand resting protectively on her. He felt every single person in the restaurant watching him. He'd walked into Raelia feeling like a king. Now, he was leaving like a court jester. Julian? Amelia's voice was quiet. Are we still going to Gustard? He turned to her, his face like a thundercloud, and he really saw her for the first time. She wasn't a prize. She was the same as Dick. The cheap, flashy thing he'd traded a dynasty for. Get the car, he growled. He was wrong. This was not over. This was war. The next 72 hours of Julian Thorne's life were a complete blur of cold anger and obsession. He didn't go to the office. He locked himself in his penthouse, a sterile glass box over Central Park, and just shut out the world. He shut out Amelia, sending her home in an SUV with a blunt, I need to think. He ignored his board, his partners, and all the calls congratulating him on the Odyssey project. The project suddenly felt like ashes in his mouth. He only made one call to a man named Mr. Flint. Mr. Flint didn't have an office or a website. He was a fixer, a ghost who handled high-stakes intelligence. He cost a fortune but was worth every penny. I need everything. Julian barked into the secure phone, pacing his huge empty living room. Damien Salvatore and Elena Hayes, that's her maiden name. When they met, where they live, I want to know everything. I want the brand of her toothpaste. And the pregnancy. Everything, the timeline, Flint's gravelly voice replied. That's the main thing. That's the main thing, Julian confirmed. I want it yesterday. While Flint got to work, Julian drank. He drank 18-year-old scotch and stared at the one photo of Elena he'd never gotten around to throwing out. It was from the Met Gala 3 years ago. She was in a custom Oscar de la Renta, smiling right at him. He remembered being bored that night, secretly texting a model under the table. Now the memory made him sick, not with guilt, but with the feeling of being completely outplayed. He'd thrown away a queen for a pawn. Flint delivered the package 48 hours later. It wasn't an email. It was a plain manila envelope delivered by a special courier to his private elevator. Julian. It was all their photos, timelines, bank statements, subject. Elena Hayes. Divorce finalized, June 14th. Met Damien Salvatore, at the Save the Children Gala on June 28th, just 2 weeks after the divorce. Julian's stomach twisted. She hadn't wasted any time.
Or had Salvatore been waiting in the wings? The timeline continued. July, Elena and Damien were photographed on his yacht in Sardinia.
August, Elena sold the Hamptons house and moved into Salvatore's penthouse at 15 Central Park West. September 1st, an OBGYN appointment was found. Dr. Aramis at Mount Sinai. Flint was very good. The estimated due date was late March or early April. Julian did the math. He actually counted backward on his fingers, his billion-dollar brain suddenly struggling with simple arithmetic. If she was due in late March, she got pregnant in July. After the divorce, the relief that hit him was so strong it almost made him dizzy. It wasn't his. The anger, the humiliation, it wasn't his child, it was Salvatore's. She was just desperate, like Amelia said. She'd jumped from one billionaire to another. He was free. The whole obsession had been for nothing. He was Julian Thorne. He had Amelia. He had one. He poured himself another scotch, a celebratory one this time, and laughed. He was about to call Amelia to make that reservation. Then he saw a second, thinner envelope at the bottom of the package. Subject: Aris Tech, Salvatore and the Odyssey Project. Julian frowned. He had asked for personal info. Why would Flint include business files? He opened it. Inside was a single document, a leaked internal memo from Aris's research division. It was a report on a new kind of battery technology, a solid-state hydrogen cell. Julian read it, and his blood ran cold. He read it a second time. The technology in this memo was impossible. It was at least 5 years ahead of anything else on the market. It was the key to making his Odyssey project a true global powerhouse. His company, Thorne Capital, had won the project using existing lithium-ion technology. Stable, but not very efficient. Damien Salvatore's company, Aris Tech, had lost the bid. The experts all said their proposal was too risky. Julian looked at the memo again. He saw the date on it, June 10th, 4 days before his divorce was final. Salvatore hadn't lost the bid at all. He had thrown it. He let Julian win the massive contract, knowing Julian would be stretched thin using last-generation tech, while Damien was sitting on the next generation. Once Julian had built all the infrastructure, the grid, the power lines, everything, Damien would swoop in, announce his revolutionary battery, and make Julian's multi-billion-dollar project worthless before it even sold its first watt of power. He wouldn't be a competitor. He would be the only person selling the one part that truly mattered. Julian would be stuck with billions in debt and a network of useless wires, and Damien Salvatore would own the power source. It was a corporate execution, and it was brilliant. Julian's world shifted. This was never about a woman. It was not a romance. It was a long con. Elena, meeting Damien, the pregnancy, it was all a distraction. It was a psychological game. Salvatore hadn't just taken his wife. He was using her like a weapon to blind him while he dismantled his company. But then a darker thought crept in. He looked at the first report again. The gala was June 28th. The doctor's appointment was in September. Conception in July. Wait, Julian's mind flashed back. He remembered the last few months of their marriage, the cold, sterile IVF clinics. He remembered the samples they needed. The very last sample he gave, the final hopeful one before he met Amelia, was in the first week of June, right before he told his lawyers to finalize the divorce. He had completely forgotten. He'd just told Elena to deal with it. He grabbed the secure phone, his hands shaking, and dialed Flint. Flint, the IVF clinic, a place called Genesis. I need to know what happened to the file. Already checked, Flint said. This is the part you're not going to like. The file is active. The last withdrawal was made on June 30th. Julian stopped breathing. The divorce was June 14th. June 28th, Elena meets Damien. Elena goes to the IVF clinic alone. The sample. Julian choked out the words. It was yours, Mr. Thorne, Flint said. Registered, cataloged, and signed for by Miss Hayes. It is 100% your biological child. The Scotch glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. It was his child. She had conceived his child with his sample after their divorce, while she was with Damien. Salvatore wasn't just stealing his company. He was letting his rival raise his own biological heir. He was stealing Julian's legacy. This was no longer just business. This was total annihilation. Julian Thorne didn't just get angry. He got strategic. That single revelation changed everything. The shock and rage hardened into a clear, sharp strategy. He was no longer a man mourning a lost love. He was a king fighting for his bloodline. The child, his heir, was being held in the enemy's camp. This was now a rescue mission. He didn't call his lawyers, not yet. This was not a legal battle. It was a psychological attack. He had to shatter the foundation of their new life. He needed to remind Elena who she was and what she had stolen from him. He found her, thanks to Flint's thorough report, 15 Central Park West, Damien Salvatore's fortress. Julian didn't bother to call. He just appeared. The doorman, a huge man in a crisp uniform, tried to block his path. "Mr. Thorne." "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Salvatore is not expecting you. I'm here to see Elena," Julian said, pushing right past him. The doorman reached out to stop him, but Julian's eyes were pure murder. "Touch me, and I'll buy this building by noon, just so I can fire you. Call up. Tell her Julian Thorne is waiting in her lobby." The man went pale and quickly made the call. A moment later, an elevator chimed, its doors opening right into the lobby. It was waiting for him. He was being let in. The elevator opened directly into a massive 5,000 square foot penthouse. It wasn't Julian's style. He preferred chrome and glass. This place was warm, with bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling. A fireplace was steady burning, smelling of old wood and something baking in an oven. It felt like a real home. He absolutely hated it. Elena was standing near the enormous windows that overlooked the park. She wore a simple cashmere wrap, and in the daylight she looked even more stunning than she had at the gala. She was all alone. "You're trespassing, Julian," she said without turning around. "You're a thief," he shot back, his voice echoing in the huge room. She finally turned, her face perfectly calm. "You're going to have to be more specific. You've accused me of many things, wasting your time, not being ambitious, being boring. Thief is a new one. The baby." He strode toward the center of the room. "The child, my child." Elena's hand flew to her stomach in a protective gesture as old as time itself. "You gave up the right to call him that. I gave up no such thing. You used me. After our divorce, you went to Genesis. You took what was mine. Why?" "What was ours," she corrected, her voice rising for the first time. "What we made. What was I supposed to do?" "Just throw it away because you found a newer, shinier toy. You told me to deal with it, Julian. So I did. This child was the only part of our marriage that wasn't a complete lie. And what is this?" Julian sneered, waving a hand at the luxurious room. "What's Salvatore? Is he a lie too? Or just a convenient placeholder, a rich babysitter? He's a better man than you will ever be," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, venomous tone. "He's a man who showed up. He's a man who sat with me through morning sickness, who held my hand during the amniocentesis. He's a man who reads to this baby every single night. He is, in every way that truly matters, this child's father." "A father?" Julian laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Biology, Elena? That's all that matters. Sissy, blood. This child is a thorn, and no Salvatore is going to raise him. I'm for custody. Full custody." Elena's face went completely white. "You wouldn't. Watch me. I'll drag you and him through every court in this state. I'll prove you're an unfit mother. I'll prove you're an accessory to a corporate criminal." "A corporate criminal?" she scoffed. "You're delusional." "Am I?" Julian was on a roll now. He was winning. The Odyssey project, the solid-state battery, Ares Tech. He played a long con, and he used you as the grand prize. You think he loves you. He's using you to get to me, and you were stupid enough to fall for it. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. He'd hit a nerve. He moved closer. "He's using you, Elena. He let me win Odyssey so he could bankrupt me later with his new technology. And he's using my son as the final psychological blow. Just think about the timeline. He orchestrated this entire thing. He's a monster, and you brought him to my child." Elena was shaking her head, her tears welling in her eyes. No, he wouldn't do that." "He did," Julian said, his voice softening, becoming almost a whisper. "But it's not too late. You can fix this. Come back to me. You, me, and our son. We can be a family again. We can merge Thorne Capital and Ares Tech. We can rule everything." He had reached her now. He placed a hand on her arm. "It's all I ever wanted, Julian," she whispered, looking up at him as tears streamed down her face. "A family." "I know," he said, pulling her closer. "I know. I was a fool." He was about to kiss her. He had won. He had his wife, his child, and his enemy's greatest asset all in one single move. Take your hand off my fiancé, Thorne, now. The voice came from the doorway. Damien Salvatore stood there, a leather briefcase in one hand. He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't even angry. He was just completely, utterly still. He radiated the calm of an apex predator, which was far more terrifying than Julian's explosive rage. Elena ripped herself from Julian's grasp, her face a mask of shame and confusion. Damien, he said. I heard what he said, Damien said, walking calmly into the room. He set his briefcase on a coffee table. He said I was using you. He said I was a monster. He said he wants to merge our companies. He looked directly at Julian. Are you really that desperate? I'm here for my son. Julian spat, his bravado returning. You're a thief, Salvador. You're trying to steal my legacy. Steal? Damien smiled, a cold, thin smile. You call this stealing? Let me tell you what stealing is, Julian. Stealing is what you're doing with the Odyssey Project. Julian froze. What are you talking about? The Odyssey Project, Damien said, is a front, a massive high-risk gamble. You're using Thorne Capital's pension funds, your own employees' money, as collateral for the Phase 2 loans. You've been cooking the books for 6 months to hide the leverage. You're not a king, Julian. You're just a gambler who has pushed all his chips in. And you're praying the last card saves you. Julian's blood ran cold. How? How could he possibly know that? Only Julian and his CFO knew about the fund allocation. And as for my technology, Damien continued, the solid-state battery, that memo you're clinging to was a fake. I leaked it to you myself. I've been feeding your Mr. Flint bad information for months. Why? Julian whispered. Because I needed to know what you would do. I needed to see if you were a businessman or just a thug. And you, Julian, you're a thug. You went straight for the personal attack. You came here to terrorize a pregnant woman. Damien turned to Elena, his whole expression softening. He took her hands in his. Elena, my love, did you ever doubt me for 1 second? Elena looked at Julian, then back at Damien. He said the timeline. Damien chuckled. The gala.
Julian, I didn't meet Elena at the gala. I've known Elena for 15 years. We were at Harvard together.
I was the one who introduced her to you. Julian's mind was reeling. He searched his memory. A vague image of a Harvard friend, someone she had lost touch with. I was in love with her, Damien said, never taking his eyes off Elena. I was a fool, and I let her go.
For a decade, I watched you break her spirit. The night you met Amelia at the Conrad Gala. Elena called me, crying. I flew in from Singapore.
I was the one who told her to finally leave you. He turned back to Julian. I didn't orchestrate this, Julian. I just showed up, like she said. But the baby, Julian stammered. Yes, the baby. Damien's face hardened. She went to the clinic. She told me she was going. She told me it was the last piece of her and she was going to have this child with or without me. And I told her. Damien placed his hand on Elena's stomach. I told her that a child deserves a father and that I would be honored to be this child's father in every way that matters. I will adopt him. He will carry my name. He will have my love. He will have my legacy. No. Julian was backing away now. This was a nightmare. Yes, Damien said. You want to sue for custody, Julian? Please try. Bring your cooked books and your pension fund theft into a family court. Let's see who they award custody to. Let's see what the SEC does. Damien picked up his briefcase.
You have no power here, Julian. You have no legacy. You're an empty suit. Now get out of my home.
Julian just stood there, shattered. He'd come in with a paternity weapon, and that weapon had just exploded in his own hands. He looked at Elena. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Damien, her eyes filled with an adoration he now realized was never for him. He was the ghost. He was the one who was trespassing here. And for the first time in his entire life, Julian Thorne retreated. But for Julian, a retreat was just a strategic repositioning. He left Damien's penthouse, but this fight was far from over. The humiliation had burned away his shock, leaving behind a cold, empty landscape of pure, unfiltered rage. He had been played from the very beginning. Damien and Elena, Harvard sweethearts, apparently had conspired to ruin him. They had used his own child, his own blood, as the ultimate weapon of revenge. The story about Ares Tech and the fake memo, he wasn't sure what to believe. But the accusation about Haas Finance, that was real, and Damien knew it. Julian was no longer fighting for a legacy. He was fighting for his life. He returned to his own penthouse and made 2 calls. The The first was to his legal team. "I want to file for paternity and full custody," he barked. "I don't care what it costs. We claim the mother is unstable, that she conspired with a business rival to defraud me. We'll use the IVF. We'll claim she stole genetic material. I want her painted as a scorned, hysterical woman and Salvatore as a predator." Julian, his lawyer, a man named Sterling, cautioned, That's scorched earth. In family court, that can seriously backfire. This is scorched earth, Sterling. Burn it all down." The second call was to a darker contact, not Flint, who was clearly compromised, but to a specialist in opposition research. "I don't care if it's true," Julian commanded. "I want stories planted about Ares Tech's green technology. Link it to toxic waste in a third world country. And Damien Salvatore, I want rumors of insider trading. The SEC should be sniffing around him, not me." He was now fighting a war on two fronts, both personal and professional. While his lawyers buried Elena in paperwork, his secret PR team went after Salvatore. He emptied a rainy day fund, moving $100 million into offshore accounts to pay for the assault. He also had to deal with the Amelia problem. She was waiting for him at his penthouse, having finally been let inside. She wore a red dress, but her face was ghostly white with worry. "Julian,
Thank God.
she breathed, rushing toward him. "People are saying things," my agent called. "He said there's a rumor Thorn Capital is in trouble, and Custard, well, is everywhere. Is it true about your ex-wife?" Julian just looked at her, feeling nothing but irritation. She was a child, a bauble. She couldn't understand the level of the game being played.
Amelia, busy, he said.
Walking right past her to the bar. "Busy?"
Julian, I've by your side. I've been your partner. You promised me. I promised you a good time,
Julian said, pouring a brandy. "And you've had it. Right now I'm in a war. You're not built for war." The color drained from her face, replaced by a flash of anger. "Not built for it? I'm the one who charmed Senator Walsh. I'm the one who got you the meeting for Odyssey. You used me. We used each other, darling. That was the deal." "No," she said, her voice shaking. I thought you loved me." Julian laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Love you?"
"Oh, Amelia, don't be naive. You were a transaction, and frankly, the deal is closed."
He turned his back on her, expecting tears, maybe a slammed door. He did not expect the tiny click of a phone's record button. He spun around. Amelia was holding her iPhone, her hand perfectly steady, her eyes shining with a coldness he'd never seen. "That's all I needed," she said. "What is that?" Julian growled, moving toward her. "Give me the phone." "No," she said, backing away. "You think I'm stupid. You think I'm just a bauble. I've been with you for a year, Julian. I've heard your calls as I have seen the real books, the ones you keep in the safe behind the Matisse." Julian froze. "The pension fund collateral, the offshore accounts, the rainy day fund you just drained to attack Damien Salvatore?" She continued, a bitter smile on her face. "You didn't close this deal, Julian. You just default. You wouldn't," he whispered. "You'd be implicated. It's suicide." "It's a life raft," Amelia corrected. "I'm not a bauble. I'm an accomplice. And I am not going down with your ship. You think Elena is your enemy? You haven't even begun to see what a woman you've scorned can do."
She held up the phone. "This recording. You were a transaction. I'm in a war, plus the other recordings I've made over the last 6 months."
"I think the Wall Street Journal will find them fascinating. Or maybe Damien Salvatore will." Damien, Julian looked at the woman he had so careless dismissed. He had seen her as a distraction, a simple, pretty thing. He'd been so focused on the threat from Elena and Damien that he ignored the viper he'd brought into his own bed. He had built a golden cage for everyone in his life, and he had just handed the key to the one person he underestimated the most. "Amelia, wait," he said, his voice pleading for the very first time. Let's talk about this. What do you want? Money? Custard? It's yours." Amelia smiled a brilliant, terrible smile. "What do I want, Julian? I want what Elena has. I want everything." She walked to the elevator, her hips swaying, and pressed the button. "You know," she said as the door slid open, "I was never really interested in custard. I was just interested in what it took to get there. And I think I just got it." The doors closed, leaving Julian Thorne alone in his penthouse, the silence of the room suddenly deafening. He was being attacked from all sides. His ex-wife and her new lover had his heir. His mistress had all his secrets. He ran to the safe behind the Matisse. He spun the dial, his hands fumbling, and pulled it open. The ledgers were gone. Of course they were. The phone rang. It was his lawyer, Sterling. "Julian, we have a problem. A real problem.
The SEC just froze your main trading account.
And the Wall Street Journal is on line 1. Julian sank to his knees. The war wasn't on two fronts. It was a 360-degree ambush, and the final shot hadn't come from his rival or his ex-wife. It had come from the bauble he'd so foolishly thrown away. The collapse was not a slow decay. It was a detonation. It began not with a whisper, but with the screaming digital alarm of his entire life unraveling at once. Julian was in his penthouse, his sky-high fortress that now felt like a glass prison, when his lawyer, Sterling, called. "Julian, it's over." Sterling's voice was thin, all its usual confidence gone. It wasn't a leak, it was a formal proffer. Amelia Vance. She walked into the SEC's New York office this morning with her lawyer. And Julian, she had everything. The real ledgers, the offshore account numbers, the pension fund transfers. They've granted her full transactional immunity in exchange for her testimony. Testimony? Julian barked, a cold sweat on his brow. "She's an accessory." "She's a witness, Julian." Sterling shot back. "She's the witness who's burning you to the ground to save herself. The U.S. Marshals are on their way to your office. The SEC has filed an emergency injunction. They're freezing everything. Thorn Capital, your personal accounts, your homes, your cars. As of this moment, you are paralyzed." Before Julian could even process the word paralyzed, his other line lit up. It was the Wall Street Journal. He stared at the name, not understanding. He picked it up. "Mr. Thorne," a crisp young voice said, "Sam Abernathy, Wall Street Journal. We're running a story in 1 hour about massive, systematic fraud at the Thorn Capital Pension Fund and its use for the Odyssey project. We have confirmed the SEC is executing a freeze. Would you care to comment?" Julian's voice was a low growl. "You print one word of that lie and I will buy your entire paper just to fire you and everyone you've ever met." There was a cold, pitying pause on the other end. "With what, Mr. Thorne?" "According to our sources, you don't have the funds to buy a cup of coffee. The story runs in 59 minutes. The line went dead. The click of the hang-up was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of his world ending. In a single moment, he was erased. He was staring at the dead phone when his Patek Philippe, the one asset they hadn't yet taken from his wrist, buzzed. It was a page 6 alert, a silly piece of digital trash he subscribed to for fun. Spotted. Tech mogul Damien Salvatore and pregnant ex-socialite Elena Hayes Thorne rushing into Mount Sinai's private maternity wing. Is baby Salvatore on the way? The room, which had been spinning, suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. The SEC, the journal, the fraud, all of it instant became meaningless noise. It was just static. Event. The only thing that ever mattered, his legacy, his blood, his heir, was happening right now. He didn't grab a coat. He didn't call for a driver. He sprinted to his private elevator, his mind a white-hot scream. "My son, my son, my son." The doorman in the lobby, a man whose name Julian had never bothered to learn, saw his boss, wild-eyed and terrified, and simply looked away. The news was already out. Julian burst onto the street, trying to summon his Maybach. It didn't come. He ran to the proprietor. It was sealed. A single, stark white notice was taped to the steel door. Property seized by the U.S. Marshals Service. He was a king without a kingdom. A man with $1 billion name who couldn't even get his own car. He stumbled onto Central Park West and did the most humiliating foreign thing he could imagine. He stuck out his hand and hailed a yellow taxi. The driver, glancing at his manic, unshaven face in the rearview mirror, had the radio on. A news anchor was saying, "Thorn Capital in a stunning fall from grace. Mount Sinai?" Julian growled, his voice a rasp. "Private maternity now." The driver looked again. "Hey, pal, you that Thorn guy? Just drive," Julian roared. The hospital wing had his name on it, the Thorn Family Perinatal Center. The irony was a physical sickness, a coppery taste in his mouth. He had built this place in his own honor, and now he was crawling into it like a beggar. He slammed through the doors and confronted the nurse at the welcome desk. "Elena Hayes," he panted, gripping the marble countertop. "I'm Julian Thorne." The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and an unbreakable will, typed his name. Her expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. I don't have you on the approved visitor list." "The approved list?" His voice cracked, echoing in the quiet, lavish hall. "I'm the father I paid for this wing. Sir, I understand you're upset, but Miss Hayes's birth plan is a legally binding document. Only Mr. Salvatore is permitted in the delivery suite and recovery. I am the biological father, he yelled, slamming his fist on the desk. Get a doctor. Get me in that room. Sir, I'm going to have to call security. That won't be necessary. Karen. The voice came from the hallway. It was Damien Salvatore, but this was not the Damien from the restaurant or the apex predator from the penthouse. This Damien was in pale blue scrubs, his hair matted to his forehead with sweat, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow with a terror Julian recognized instantly. It was the terror of being completely powerless. Julian, he said, his voice flat and exhausted. Where is she? Julian demanded, moving toward him. Where is my son? Damien's face tightened, but he didn't move. She's in surgery, he said, his voice cracking just once. An emergency C-section. The baby's heart rate was dropping. The cord, it's wrapped. He looked at Julian, and for one agonizing moment the rivalry evaporated. They were just two men staring at a closed steel door. Is he? Julian couldn't finish the question. We don't know, Damien whispered. They've been in there for 40 minutes. They don't know. The two men stood in the sterile white corridor. The king and the man who'd taken his throne. All the money, all the power, all the anger, it was all useless. They were just two men waiting for a doctor to come through a door. Time stretched on. Julian's $150,000 watch seemed to mock him, its second hand ticking with an agonizingly slow rhythm. He paced. Damien stood with his back against the wall, staring at the red surgery light, as if he could change it with his gaze. Elena, Julian found himself saying, the name tasting like ash. She went to the SC. She took everything. Damien looked at him, his eyes dead. I know. My board has been calling all morning. Worried your collapse will tank the market. He said it not as a taunt, but as a simple, tired fact. He shook his head. It doesn't seem to matter very much right now, does it? No, Julian whispered. Nothing. Another 30 minutes passed in that suffocating silence. Finally, the surgery light snapped off. The doors burst open. A doctor, his mask down, beaming with a weary smile, strode out. Mr. Salvatore. Damien stumbled forward, grabbing the doctor's arm. Yes, Elena, the baby, are they? She's a champion, the doctor said, grinning. She's stable and heading to recovery. And you have a son, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He gave us a real scare, but his size of fart. Both are perfectly, beautifully fine. The relief that hit Damien was a physical force. He sagged against the wall, burying his face in his hands, and let out a strangled, breathless sob of pure joy. Julian felt it too, a wave of profound, selfish, overwhelming relief. He's alive. My son is alive. We're taking him to the nursery for observation. You can see him now, and Miss Hayes is being moved to recovery room 301, the doctor said before moving on. Damien wiped his face and composed himself. The steel returned to his spine. The truce was over. He looked at Julian, his eyes once again cold and assessing. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the nursery. Julian followed, a shadow, a ghost. They stood at the large glass window. A smiling nurse rolled a small, clear bassinet into view. Taped to the front was a small white card. Baby boy Salvatore. The name was a punch to the gut. But then Julian saw him. He was tiny. He had a thatch of dark, wet hair. His face was red and scrunched, but he was perfect. As Julian watched, the baby's tiny starfish-sized hand waved in the air, and he yawned. Julian's own hand came up, pressing against the cold glass, mirroring his son's. He felt a deep, primal pull in his chest he had never known. That was his. That was his blood. That was his legacy. Julian's voice was thick and broken. He's beautiful. Yes, Damien said, his voice a blade of ice. He is. The moment was shattered by the sound of a gurney. A nurse was wheeling Elena out of the surgical bay. She was pale, her eyes closed, but she was smiling. Damien, she whispered, not opening her eyes. I'm here, my love, Damien said, rushing to her side, his voice softening instantly to a lover's murmur. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, her hand. I'm here. He's perfect, Elena, he's perfect. I want to see him, she whispered. Our son. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw Damien, and her face lit up with a love so profound it was almost blinding. Then her gaze drifted past Damien. She saw Julian, his hand pressed to the nursery glass. Her smile did not falter. Her face did not twist in anger. It simply closed. The light went out. She looked right through him, as if he were a vein of glass, a mildly annoying reflection. Then she turned her head in a simple, final, devastating act of dismissal and looked only at Damien. "Darling," she said, her voice weak but firm, "take me to our son. I'm tired." "Of course, my love." Damien pushed her wheelchair toward a private recovery room 301. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut, leaving Julian alone in the corridor, staring at the white wooden barrier.
He had lost.
The door opened one last time. Damien stepped out, closing it gently behind him. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Julian. "She doesn't want to see you," Damien stated. "He's my son," Julian hissed, a desperate, pathetic plea. "You saw him, he's mine." "No," Damien said, his voice low and lethal. "He's not yours. You were a biological component, a donor. You're not a father. A father is the man who sat with her through the morning sickness you caused, and he cured. A father is the man who held her hand while she was terrified in that operating room. A father is the man who will teach him to ride a bike, who will be there for his first day of school, who will show him what it means to love a woman with respect. That will be me." "I'll fight you," Julian stammered. "Paternity, custody." Damien cut him off. "You'll fight me from a federal prison. You're a pauper. Your name is radioactive. By the time you get out, if you get out, my son will be in college. My lawyers will ensure you are nothing but a redacted line in a court document. You don't exist." Damien leaned in for the final fatal blow. "You thought this was about a company. You thought this was about a baby. You are so small. This was about a life you threw away. You will have no part in it. Your legacy isn't that baby. Your legacy is an SEC filing. You are a footnote in your own son's story. Is that clear?" Julian couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He was utterly, finally broken. "Good." Damien gave a single curt nod. He opened the door, room 301, and walked back to his fiancée, his family, and his son. The door clicked shut. Julian stood in the sterile white corridor of the wing that bore his name. He could faintly hear through the door the sound of a baby crying, and then a woman's soft, soothing voice. The shock he'd felt seeing her before. That was just a cold snap. This was the Ice Age. This was the reckoning. He was a ghost left to haunt the happiest day of his enemy's life. He had lost his company to his arrogance, his mistress to his cruelty, and his one true legacy to a better man. He turned, and for the first time in his life, with not a single person in the world watching, Julian Thorne walked away. In the end, Julian Thorne learned the hardest lesson. You cannot put a price on legacy, and you cannot build an empire on a rotten foundation. He lost his company to his arrogance, his mistress to his cruelty, and his child to the man who understood something he never did. Love is the only asset that truly appreciates. He thought he was in a war for his company, but he was really in a war for his soul, and he had already sold it. What do you think? Was this justice, or was it the ultimate revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were riveted by this story of power, betrayal, and consequence, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good drama, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more stories where the mighty don't just fall, they crash.